We're here in the Shanghai International Circuit paddock ahead of the Chinese Grand Prix, and the really big talking point has been the technical directive the FIA issued, which reduces the amount of variance allowed in that slot gap between the main plane and the flap of the rear wing, and that's all about reducing the amount of mini-DRS effect, as it's called. Previously, there was 2 millimetres allowed in terms of the extra amount of opening you could have. Now it's down to 0.5 millimetres, but with a 0.25 millimetres allowance for this race weekend, that effectively makes it 0.75 millimetres. So, John, you've been running around the Shanghai paddock like a lunatic today. You've spoken to anyone and everyone who knows about this. So what have you learned about why this technical directive has been issued?
This has been bubbling away since before the season started, basically. Bahrain testing, teams obviously first time they get to see each other going around, testing, looking at the cars, and they observe. They keep an eye on video footage, they keep an eye on photographs. And it was Pierre Vacher, the Red Bull technical director, in an interview I did with him, talked about mini-DRS. He named 2 teams, McLaren and Ferrari, said that they're doing these tricks again. And it's bubbled away since then. So we had an FIA observation on what they were doing from Melbourne, and then this technical directive. Now, what it revolves around is it's the same effect as last year, when McLaren had mini-DRS of raising the DRS flap up a little to kind of reduce that frontal area and boost drag. But it's now moved to the outboard area, so beyond the DRS. Similar thing, the slot gap increases, but it has a dual impact. First of all, it decreases the frontal area, so you reduce drag. But secondly, more importantly, and this is, I think, why teams are quite hot on what looks like a very small thing, is it stalls the wing, which kind of gives you an instant release of downforce, reduces drag, and can give you a straight line speed boost that's quite significant. And then that allows you to better balance the car around the lap. So it's something that has been observed to a lesser or greater degree, which we'll come into later, because I think teams have been playing around with this and are running it and have run it in the past and aren't running it now and have made changes. But it's definitely something that has been evolving and is evolving, and this may not even be the end of it this weekend.
And of course, that effect could be hugely beneficial at a track like this with a big balance of high and low speed corners and a very, very long straight. Now, you mentioned a couple of teams who are suspected to be involved. I think the number of teams supposedly involved, according to the FIA, is 4. So who have you got?
Yeah, so we've this has initially been surrounded by McLaren and Ferrari, were the 2 teams that Red Bull names. I understand that there are 4 teams that kind of have caught the attention of the FIA. It's important to say no one's been found illegal. Everyone's passed the tests. Everyone's car's fully complied with the regulations up until this point. But we understand, this is speaking to other teams, kind of speaking to the FIA, there's no official, this is the 4, but we understand it's also Alpine and it's also Haas. So 2 other teams that have been looked at, and they will be under the spotlight, and the FIA tests will see this weekend if they comply or they don't comply.
Absolutely. They said they all complied in Australia, so it's very much about clamping down rather than any historic offences. But the interesting thing is, John, is you mentioned McLaren there. Now, McLaren say they've changed nothing. Lando Norris even said not only have we changed nothing, but if anything, this shows we weren't pushing hard enough. So how do you square that circle? What's McLaren done or not done?
I think this is a classic scenario of you have to define, when teams say we've changed nothing, you have to define, does that mean change of parts, so actually a definitive new wing, or does it mean change of setup? Because I think there are kind of various things of what people are telling you isn't necessarily the entire picture. Because it was interesting, I spoke to Ayao Komatsu today and asked him about getting dragged into what is in effect a fight between the top teams. This isn't about anything trying to slow down Haas. They've got their own problems anyway. But I said to him, if you had to make any changes to the car, and he gave kind of half an answer out, we've not had to make any changes, no, which just seemed a strange answer, and I pushed it on him. And he said, which is quite interesting, he said, we may have to change a little bit how we set up the wing, but not the design or anything, which makes me suggest that a lot of this could be doing setup, how you position the wing, what elements you're using. So in theory, you can run the same wing, they haven't changed the wing, but it's been run in a different way, a changed way, so to speak. So I think this is what McLaren are. I also understand that they ran different wing configurations in Bahrain. This phenomenon wasn't observed all the time. But the wing they ran in Melbourne is the same wing they did run once in the test in Bahrain, and it's the wing they've got here. So there may be a wing that does this more, which is what other teams have spotted. This wing may be okay. But McLaren have a degree of confidence that they did the test. Lando Norris's car was checked after the race in Australia. It had four tests of flexibility. It passed all of them. They will be aware, McLaren will be aware of what the tolerance was then. We don't know, we can't tell, but they're very confident they will still pass the test with that configuration. So that'll be an interesting thing to see this weekend.
I'm sure there's going to be plenty more talk about it during the weekend. And of course, the question everyone will be asking is, what difference will this make to the competitive order? Are we going to see a big shake-up at the front? Will McLaren suddenly be fifth?
I don't think it's going to be a massive effect. We're not talking about a team at the front suddenly gets rid of the ability to have a bit of wing flexibility and stuck in the midfield. But we're in a period where there's not much difference between the cars. We're talking hundredths of a second in qualifying. And I think what you're seeing, what we saw in Australia, and this is also something I'll go back to about Ferrari, is that when a car is perfectly balanced and it's in a sweet spot with the tyres and a sweet spot with the car handling, a sweet spot with the mechanical balance and the aero balance, it can fly. If we go back to the end of last season, this is something that Charles Leclerc mentioned earlier. We had 4 races at the end of last year where the cars are well understood. They're pretty defined. There weren't any major upgrades that changed the pecking order. So we had a static look in a season where there's very little to choose between the cars. And we had Mercedes dominating Vegas by miles. We had McLaren dominating Abu Dhabi by miles. We had Ferrari being dominant in Mexico City. So this is what we're seeing. When a car's hooked up these days, it can make a massive difference, even if the differences are very, very small. So I think it's all about kind of unsettling the opposition, getting the car out of the sweet spot. And this will be the key. If you lose some of the tools to balance, does it push you out of the window into a phase like we saw with Ferrari in Melbourne, for example? It couldn't get hooked up in Q2. Tyres weren't looking after in the final sector, and it struggled. So this is about as much about straight line speed as it is about car balance and kind of perfecting and looking after the tyres.
It's all about the perfect compromise with these cars, as always. And one of the interesting little subplots we've had is the talk about how dominant McLaren is. George Russell says, oh, they're as dominant, if not more dominant, as Red Bull's ever been. And Oscar Piastri in his little media session was saying, well, he can give up on the season if he wants, but we don't think it's that big. And that seems to be a big underlying thing, isn't it? The fear that Mercedes, or rather the fear that McLaren, said Mercedes, because so used to them dominating in the past, but the fear that McLaren is so well on top now that they can just waltz to the title, focus on 26 as well, and just dominate it. So everybody's trying to find every possible way they can try and bring McLaren back. And this mini-DRS thing and the lobbying there's been is just a part of that.
Yeah, I think what also teams have seen is that this isn't a dominant car. The McLaren, the MCL 39, is not dominant because it's got 50 more points of downforce than everybody else. It's not dominant because it's a second a lap quicker in qualifying and can nail everything. It's dominant because they are doing something incredible with the tyres. This is something that's kind of been bubbling away. The team have worked on it. They targeted specific, looking after the tyres better over the winter. Andrea Stella said in Melbourne that he was surprised. It was a target they aimed for, but actually they've done a much better job than they anticipated. And I think this is the difficult thing for teams to chase. If they were just chasing pure more downforce, it's a very simple task because you say to your guys in the wind tunnel, we need 20 more points downforce, we can close the gap. But this is about your car balance. This is about your interaction of suspension and tyres. It's about downforce levels, wing levels, driver confidence. And I think it's a much harder gap to bridge than it is in an old sense when a car was just out and out quicker in pure performance terms. So this is the dynamics of championship we've got now. But as I mentioned earlier, it's those last 4 races, or the 4 races at the end of last season, which gave us huge dramatic swings. Maybe Melbourne isn't the true story of what we've got at the moment. It could swing and change.
Absolutely, it could change. And of course, this is very much a track that is normally front limited. McLaren struggled a bit sometimes when there was front limited graining races last year. And although last year China was a rear surface overheating, normally it's front limited. So this weekend could tell us a lot about whether McLaren really is as dominant as George Russell says it is.